have a confession to make. I grew up watching Disney movies on VHS, and I loved The Little Mermaid. I loved the music. I thought Scuttle was hilarious. I was totally mesmerized by this magical world that existed under the sea. And I admit, I was also totally invested in Ariel's pursuit of Eric. I don't think I thought for 1 second about her trading her voice for legs, other than this was just a really intriguing part of the plot. Then in the early days of my doctoral research, I came across some really disturbing information about mermaids and sirens, a mythological relative to the mermaid. I was reading a scholar named Adriana Cavarero, and she argued that the way sirens were portrayed in art and literature taught readers and observers that women should be seen and not heard. Reading this really made me so angry. I felt a really intense urgency to integrate Cavarero's ideas into my own work as a pianist. I had been reading Cavarero and Hannah Arendt because I was intrigued by their ideas on relationality and political action by way of speech and using the physical voice. As a pianist, I don't need to use my voice to make my instrument work, but Arendt and Cavarero's work inspired me to think very deeply about the consequences of not using my voice in the concert space, especially in performances of works such as Ravel's Ondine, where the protagonist has such a long and dark history of suppression of her voice and violence inflicted upon her. Cavarero's work inspired me to do further research into sirens and other related mythological figures, and I discovered countless depictions in art, literature, and music. Did you know that the first depiction of sirens portrays these figures as omniscient beings? Yeah, so these early sirens in the Homeric epic, the Odyssey, had the capacity to narrate. They could impart wisdom to all those who heard their voices. Actually, the physical appearance of these sirens was not even described, but their voices were the focus of their identity. So the goddess and the enchantress Circe warns Odysseus of the power of these sirens' voices. And so she proposes that he have his sailors bind him to the mast of his ship so that he can still hear the sirens' voices, but he won't be able to physically follow them, ultimately to his death. Cavarero argues that these Homeric sirens upset the androcentric system because, in the symbolic patriarchal order, man is conceived as mind and woman as body. She also explains that in Greek, the term phone, which in English translates to sound, is gendered feminine, whereas the Greek term semantikon, which translates in English to meaning, is gendered masculine. So therefore, these sirens that use their voices and impart wisdom are ultimately usurping this masculine speciality of knowledge and language. This is really interesting. However, so many of the depictions of sirens and related mythological figures like the water sprite have not been portrayed this way. Let's look at Apollonius of Rhodes' Argonautica, for example. These sirens do not have the capacity to narrate anymore. Their voices are asemantic. That means they don't have any capacity to say words. So presumably they are just singing on a vowel. Their physical appearances are described, however. They're described as partly like birds and partly like young maidens, confirming their femininity. Their voices are also described as lily pure and virgin voices, which further confirms their gender. In the Argonautica, instead of being bound to the mast of the ship, the protagonist, Orpheus, takes out a lyre and plays so loudly that he drowns out the sirens singing. There is a scholar named Silvia Montilio, and she argues that the sirens' voices were raped by Orpheus's loud playing on his lyre. She justifies this claim by saying that not only were the voices drowned out by a better player, but by a louder, more forceful one. These sirens obviously did not upset the androcentric system because without any semantic quality to their voices, they had no agency. I'm going to skip ahead in time now to 1811 when German writer Friedrich Fouqué published a fairy tale called Undine. This is a tale about a water sprite. And she's a sort of shapeshifter because she is from the water. She originates from water and she's made of water, but she can also exist on land. Her goal is to marry a mortal man because Undines do not have souls. So Undine ultimately does marry a mortal named Hildebrand. But after a time, he becomes interested in another woman named Bertalda, and Undine returns to her life in the water. Despite her warnings to Hildebrand, he ends up marrying Bertalda, and Undine returns to give him one final kiss, and she drowns him with her tears. While this story of Undine is not at all the same story as that of the sirens, there are many similarities between the figures, such as their beauty, their enigmatic nature, their association to water, their search for connection to a human man, and their danger. While I grew up watching The Little Mermaid, I admit that I was not at all aware of Hans Christian Andersen's fairy tale until I was down the rabbit hole of my doctoral research. I was honestly horrified and disgusted when I read this for the first time. The entire story centers around the beauty of the Little Mermaid and the beauty of her voice. She doesn't even have a name. Throughout the entire story, she's just referenced as the Little Mermaid. Andersen describes her as silent and pensive, which highlights the notion that women should be seen and not heard, as Cavarero pointed out. This Little Mermaid has the upper body of a woman and the lower half of a fish, just like in the Disney adaptation. She's also in search of a mortal man, but the trade she makes is at a very high cost to her. In order for the sea witch to grant the Little Mermaid legs, she has to cut out her tongue. The Little Mermaid asks the sea witch, "If you take my voice, what will be left of me?" To which the sea witch replies, "Your lovely shape, your lightsome gait, and your speaking eye, you can fool a man's heart with them." In addition to the violence of having her tongue cut out, the pain that the Little Mermaid suffers by trading her fishtail for legs is so severe that it feels as though a double-edged sword pierced straight through her entire body. Andersen thus teaches readers that men are really just interested in a woman's beauty, and that in order for her to gain his love, she must suffer physical pain. Here is another shocking depiction of a siren. This is a 20th century painting by a painter named René Magritte. It's called The Collective Invention. What bothers you or upsets you about this image? I'll tell you what bothers me. With the head of a fish, this siren does not have any human intelligence. She obviously cannot express any ideas or knowledge. Her naked lower half highlights her sexuality. She really only exists for male desire and sexual pleasure. As a fish out of water, she will ultimately die. While we cannot see any violence being inflicted upon this siren, the way that her physical body is painted demonstrates her inability to resist danger, thus teaching us that silence signifies consent. There is one last depiction of a siren that I would like to share before I dive into Ravel's portrayal of Ondine. In 1946, Franz Kafka's short story called The Silence of the Sirens was published. Already, the title is not very optimistic for the sirens. In this 20th century retelling of the Homeric epic, the sirens have the face of a woman and the body of a bird. So these are not at all the same figures as the folkloric mermaids. Rather, they're much more similar to early depictions of sirens, which were creatures of land and air. In this story, the protagonist conquers the sirens by gazing so intently upon them that the sirens stop singing. Odysseus observes their throats rising and falling, their breasts lifting, their lips half parted. Even the juxtaposition of these words sexualizes these figures. their throats juxtaposed next to their breasts, next to their lips, all in one sentence. What stands out to me above all else in this retelling of the Homeric epic is the power of the male gaze. Not only is this story written by a man, but he wrote a story about another man gazing so intently upon these sexualized female figures that they were silenced. In the 21st century, we don't really talk about the male gaze as a positive act or something for which a man should be proud. In Kafka's story, the male gaze is what saves Odysseus, casting a positive light on his arrogance. In all of the artistic and literary depictions of sirens and water sprites that I have discussed, there's a recurring link between the figure's sexuality, her voice, her agency, and danger. There's an overarching theme, as Cavarero says, that a woman should be seen and not heard. In the case of the Magritte painting, we understand that silence can also signify consent. Throughout history, these depictions teach us that it's okay for women to be silenced, or for women to not have a voice at all, or to not have the capacity to share wisdom, knowledge, thoughts, or opinions. I argue that the suppression of voices and the violence inflicted upon these mythological figures mirrors the injustices that women continue to face globally, even in 2025. Okay, Ravel's mesmerizing Ondine. This is a piece that has been beloved by so many people since its composition in 1908. And for good reason. It is stunning. Most people talk about how virtuosic it is, and that makes sense. Scholars and pianists talk a lot about the structure and the harmonic figuration, and really, for good reason, because it is masterful. However, I'm interested in Ondine, the protagonist, how Ravel portrays her, who she is, and how he musically depicts her voice. Ravel based his piece on a poem by a French poet named Aloysius Bertrand. This tells a story of another water sprite named Ondine. She has the capacity to narrate and to express thoughts and ideas, which is unlike many of the artistic and literary depictions of sirens throughout the years. But her character is a little bit ambiguous. Sometimes Bertrand portrays her as naive and childish, and at other times he portrays her as quite powerful. After Ondine proposes to the mortal, he rejects her proposal, and then she sulks and sheds a few tears, and then she lets out a burst of laughter, and then disappears back into the water, leaving the reader questioning, who has more power at the end of this poem? Is it Ondine or is it the mortal? Ondine's laughter is important to highlight because within Romanticism, laughter from a supernatural being was connected to violence and to the diabolical. So once again, violence is connected to this mythological figure who is feminine, beautiful, seductive, associated to water. And although she has semantic quality to her voice, she is easily dismissed by the mortal. Although I studied Ravel's archival collection at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France in Paris, I could not find anything that suggested what he wanted to portray in particular about the poem in his music, other than he wanted the music to tell this story. He did not include any information in the score or in correspondences or in personal diaries or in published journals that indicate which parts of the poem he wanted to musically depict in his piece, other than the violent laughter at the end of the poem. He told a student that he wanted this to be a wild outburst, and he achieves this by superimposing major harmony on top of diminished harmony, as you can see here. The major harmony alludes to Ondine's naivety, depicted in Bertrand's poem, and the diminished harmony alludes to her true sinister nature. We can hear the rising of her diabolical laughter in these ascending arpeggios, and then we hear her cackling, punctuated by the upper notes of the descending figures. The contour of the melody also hints at the physical curves of her feminine shape. Because she's made of water, the contour of the melody evokes not only the water from where she originates, but also the physical curves of her female figure. In order to musically portray the melody emerging from the texture of the water, Ravel wrote the melody on the piano in the same register as the oscillating figure which depicts the water. I'll show you what I mean by that. The pianist therefore has to work really intelligently to shape and project this melody so that it doesn't get lost within the texture of the water, unless, of course, their purpose is to drown out the voice like Orpheus does on his lyre. I'm going to play the figuration that depicts the water, this oscillating figure in the right hand, and then you're going to hear the melody emerging from this same texture. And you're going to see the hands are overlapping. So you can see that the way the hands are overlapping each other makes it quite difficult to bring this voice out and shape this voice so that there are no bumps along the way. And the right hand, of course, needs to be maintaining complete steadiness and complete evenness with all of the notes so that this sound is completely even, depicting the even ripples of the water. This oscillating figure in the right hand that I just played is one of the aspects of this piece that make it quite virtuosic. I'm not going to elaborate too much into this because there have been many pianists and scholars who have already discussed this at length. What I do want to highlight, however, is that because the piece is so virtuosic, in other words, because it's really difficult technically to play, it makes it quite inaccessible to many pianists. And although I don't think Ravel was explicitly trying to create a virtuosic piece in order to depict Ondine's inaccessibility as a supernatural being, it is an interesting result. What I really want to highlight is that although Ravel's goal was apparently to create a work of transcendental virtuosity, he chose to musically depict a mythological figure who has a long and dark history of oppression, suppression of her voice, and violence inflicted upon her. The work remains a man's perspective, of other men's perspectives, which really highlights the multiple layers of the male gaze. Also, even though Ravel includes the Bertrand's poem in his score, the piece was composed for solo piano. There is no singer to sing words along with this melody. Therefore, all a pianist can do at the piano to give Ondine a voice is to shape and project her melody in a way that it sounds like she has something really important to share. While I'm not at all suggesting that we should stop playing Ondine, I do think that the piece presents a really important opportunity to reflect on and discuss the silencing of women's voices and the perpetuation of violence inflicted upon women. Throughout the time that I have been studying Ravel's Ondine, I have really been deeply reflecting on who Ondine is, what her history is, and why all of the men in these depictions of sirens and water sprites are afraid of these female figures having a voice. I have also been reflecting on how all of the depictions of sirens and water sprites point to her sexuality as her greatest, and in some cases, her only power. Why has this been the focus for so many men throughout history? What I have focused on primarily in my work at the instrument has been ways that I can give Ondine a voice, and I've been reflecting on how I can reclaim agency for women by bringing this piece and these reflections to audiences. I do feel that this particular representation of Ondine deserves an interpreter because Ravel just left so much unsaid with just the notes on the piano, even though there are so many notes. While you listen to me play this piece, you can ponder a few questions. You can think about how Ondine's voice evokes her sexuality and danger. You can think about how Ravel evokes Ondine's material being and, by extension, her sexuality. And you can think about how understanding the history of sirens and water sprites influences your listening to this piece now. you.